Thank you, everyone, for listening to Soul Talk with host Jeremy McDonald, the author of Peace Be Still. You can check out more about our shows or about Jeremy at soultalkradio.org and jeremymcdonald.net. And now for our show.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for listening to Soul Talk. We have an amazing show today, and I'm very excited to have best-selling author Barbara Hand Clow on the show. We're going to be talking about her recent book, Revelations of the Ruby Crystal, and I'm pretty excited because this is her debut novel, and I've been reading through it. I was just telling her prior to the show that it has drawn me in, and I have not been able to put down the book. So any free time I've had, I've been reading it over the last week, and it's been exceptionally good. So Barbara, welcome to the show, and good morning, because it's morning your time. How are you?
Good morning. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Wonderful having you on the show. So I think the first question I want to ask you, because of all of your previous work, what inspired you to do a novel as opposed to, I guess, a teaching type of book? I mean, this is teaching, obviously, as well, but what inspired you to go this route?
Well, there's two reasons. First of all, back in the early days, in my 20s, what I really wanted to do was write fiction. But everything that was being published was like violent, sort of male, violence and adventure novels. And I felt like spiritual fiction and fiction that was really trying to get at deep issues, I just felt like I wouldn't get published. And so I went into nonfiction. And then over a period of 40 years, I wrote a whole series of books on various nonfiction topics, each one of them a deep exploration of a particular question. And then I finally hit age 70 a few years ago, and I went, now it's time to do what I want to do. And boy, am I ever glad that I took that turn, because what fiction is enabling me to do is to actually write about multidimensionality, but have the characters be multidimensional. And so it's giving me a much broader tableau, a much greater field to explore deep issues. And it's fun to write it, and I think it's fun to read it.
Wonderful. Well, and you get to talk about, you just get to enjoy, but it's exactly what you're saying. You get to enjoy the part of writing it, because you'd actually gone into kind of a semi-retirement for a while. Am I correct? And understanding that?
No, not really. I publish a book about every 3 years, and I know you've read some of them, and they take a tremendous amount of research. I see what you mean. In terms of being out on the road teaching, yes. I'm not out there as much. I am going to go do a small book tour this fall. But I've reached the point where it's just so difficult to get around, and fortunately there are people like you who have radio shows, and I get to talk to people on the radio, which is much easier for me.
Yeah, that definitely is, because then you get to do it in the comfort of your home.
Yeah. So, but I think reason I responded that way in the first place is I don't think of myself being in semi-retirement in terms of being part of the dialogue of what's going on this planet. I think we're in the middle of an incredible phase of time, and this novel is the first book in a trilogy. There's 2 more volumes coming. And what I'm attempting to do is track events in the timeline globally from 2011 through 2020, because I think that this period is the actual transition into the age of Aquarius. And so I'm going deeply into letting the age of Pisces go, and deeply into the beginning of the age of Aquarius, because when the great ages end, historically so far, what happens is as the old age is dying, which I think the age of Pisces is now, and the age of Pisces is basically the development of organized religions on the planet. And when an age dies, it's a tremendously difficult thing for human beings, because all kinds of things that they love and are used to living with go away, and it's very, very stressful for the planet. And so I'm attempting to I'm writing into this timeline partly to function as one of the guides at this time.
You know, it's interesting. Of course, you set this book in Rome in 2012, and the character, of course, the name is Sarah Adamson. But the interesting part is because you're of course considered to be an expert in the Mayan Calendar in our world, and you brought a lot of stuff forward about the Mayan Calendar and about the coming of the New Age. I just found it very intriguing that you, like exactly what you say, you're bringing 2011 forward, that you did set it in Rome at the beginning of Catholic, I'm just going to say Catholic oppression, and the church and things that it's done over the last 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years. And this journey, for what I'm understanding so far, is it's almost like a journey of this young woman who's been indoctrinated or even brainwashed, and her opening her heart up, and growing into. I just found the symbolism very intriguing in the story. And this book was actually inspired by people that an experience you had in your office, or the characters were inspired. Am I correct?
Yeah, all these characters. Yeah, I was in my office doodling around. I've got all kinds of meditation objects. I'm sure you're the same. And all of a sudden, all these characters appeared in a group, and I couldn't see them solid, but I was very aware of them. And I got out a yellow pad and a pen, and they gave me their names, their ages, their professions, their goals in life. They gave me a brief description of who they were, and I wrote them all down. And all of the characters in the book except one, because one of them appeared a year later. And that's what started the book. And then I told my husband about it. And that day, and he's used to me writing books, of course, because I've written like 15 books, and he's never said, "Oh, I'm so happy you're going to write another book." He never said that once, if you know what I mean. And when he heard about these characters, he said, "Oh, you got to write this. This is a novel." And so, with his encouragement initially, that's what started the whole thing. But it actually started 40 years ago. The first time I went to Tuscany and went to Rome. And a whole thing opened up for me in Rome, a whole level of depth and consciousness that I just decided it's time to explore that now.
Wow. Well, that's pretty cool. And then your daughter actually did the artwork in here as well, because she was super excited about the book as well.
Yeah, she illustrated it, and that was a wonderful experience because my son Chris, the one who just had surgery a few weeks ago, he illustrated 3 of my books, and then he was unable to do this book because he had a baby and because he had injured himself, and so my daughter stepped forward, and she's an art student and graduate and all that, and I knew she'd do a good job, but I didn't realize she would do a great job, and as her illustrations started coming in, I was just amazed, and so she'll illustrate the rest of the trilogy.
So this is a question. I guess we're kind of inspired through the conversation here. I had somebody mention to me recently. They're like, well, nothing's happened after 2012, and I'm like, there's a lot of things that have happened. You can see people awakening within. You can see it in their eyes. You can also see the struggle in people's eyes. You can also see the craziness, like you had mentioned earlier, that it's hard for people during a change of age. You can see that in their eyes. I mean, there's a tremendous amount happening in our world. It seems like it's getting worse, but it's through chaos. How do you respond to that? Because I don't know if you've heard that from people. They're saying, "Well, I don't see anything has changed. We've gone beyond 2012, and nothing has changed." And I'm like, well, to me, I can feel it changing, but...
Yeah, a lot of people, of course, say that. So first of all, things have changed, obviously. But if you look at the scope of world events, like, for example, the great migrations that are going on the planet right now, those actually started in small pieces back in 2011, 2012, and people started moving. And now what's happening is we're in the middle of a wave of change. And it's going to be extremely chaotic and difficult before it's over with. And yet, if we can understand why people are changing and why they're moving and what they're seeking, I think it's easier to deal with this type of event on the planet. And so I think it's literally absurd at this point in 2015 to try to say nothing changed in 2012. It's especially absurd now. And if you go back to 2012 and early 2013, if you can remember what was going on in your life at that point, most of the people that I know who are very spiritually inclined felt this bizarre feeling of being cast adrift, not connected, and it seemed to go on into May of 2013, into the summer of 2013. And in my own nonfiction work, I have posited the idea that we're moving more into a sense of being in the quantum field, that we're less kind of tied up and tied in to the third dimensional realm, which is linear space and time. And part of the reason this has happened, Jeremy, is just social media. Social media has just taken us into the quantum world, whether we like it or not. It just is what it is. But I think that at this point, we need to start understanding that the field that we're existing in has changed very, very radically, and we need to start seeking to understand it, which, of course, is the reason I've been writing about it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So in this book, it's interesting because Sarah, of course, is going through this. As I mentioned, we talked about earlier, she's was raised Catholic. Her father doesn't seem too open about her having any type of life other than going to school and being very sheltered, I guess is the way to put it. And she's dating. She has this meltdown with a gentleman that is and starts telling him about how what could happen to him if they started dating. And then at one point she's was dating another man, and she gets hurt, and he's the one that comes to her, and it's like she's also realizing that her entire upbringing about her faith is being shook up and realizing that everything she's been told wasn't correct.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
I think I feel very strongly that she's almost like an archetype for a lot of people in the world.
Yeah,
right
she's
now.
Certainly the classic archetype of the person who is going through a spiritual transformation and breaking away from the original religion that she was brought up in. And what you'll find as you go along further in the novel, one of the best things about fiction, as far as I'm concerned, is you start out with a character who has a certain description, such as Sarah, who's brought up as a Catholic girl and obedient to her father and studying patristics in Rome, which is the study of the early church fathers. Basically, she's a theologian. And then what happens throughout the novel is she completely transforms into a deeper human being. And so does her father eventually. And, of course, this is a trilogy, so this is going on over a long period of time. But I think the most exciting thing about writing fiction is to see the transformation going on with individuals. Because actually, I think everybody's transforming every day. But you just don't talk about it. You just don't see it. And so it's kind of really fun to take that perspective, and look at it that way.
Yeah, and I think, too, that we don't always notice our transformation happening because sometimes they're very subtle. And until they become super dramatic, But even I have to look back. It's like you just asked the question, where were you at in 2012 and 2013? And I have, I just for a second thought back, and I was like, oh, I didn't even think about it that way. And so, and how often does that happen to people throughout their journey? And they're not necessarily aware of the subtle changes happening in their life.
Yes, and sometimes you don't realize you changed until you are letting something go, and you suddenly realize, like for example, Sarah, of course, always expected to be married in her parish church in Boston, of course. And when she really realizes she's changed is when she realizes she can't marry her partner in the church. And so it's that way for all of us. Something happens in a job, something happens in a relationship, or worse than that, you wake up one day and you're married to somebody for 20 years and you realize you're not communicating or whatever it is. But usually it's when we're letting go is when we start to realize how much we've changed.
Now, the church in itself, through your research, do we think, it's very obvious that the church made very calculated decisions on oppressing information and hiding information and things that would bridge worlds. Like I think Sarah went through her process, even she's going and she's saying she believes that Jesus came here to help bridge the worlds, between spiritual and physical. In some ways, I look at, the local priest, and I think, does he know that? Or is he really just going through the same motions and really has good intentions, and is just not awake to what's happening?
Yeah, that's an interesting comment on your part, because one of the things I really tried to explore was the sacraments in this book, which I think you haven't gotten along far enough yet to get into an exploration of communion and confession, and also ordination. And I think that priests, because they're part of a hierarchy that has a certain field of energy, and because they've performed the sacraments, I think they, in a way, walk around tending to be fairly blind. It's like they know something, but they don't think they know it. It's kind of like, a good example would be that it's very clear that what happened at 9/11 is not what the government says, for sure. I mean, all you have to do is read a few books about it to realize that the whole thing that happened is actually a concocted story. And yet 95% of the people in the United States are walking around believing that story because it's been hammered into their heads so intensely and so deeply that even though they know there's something wrong and there's something different with it, they can't handle the conflict, and so they just go along buying into the official story.
Yeah. Well, in the mind, the human mind is so susceptible to suggestion.
Yeah.
That, and unless you're really self-aware, and even if you are self-aware, I find sometimes that I even get caught up in stuff, and I'm like, well, where did that come from?
Yeah, I know. And I also think that we're very susceptible to repetition. And so I think the global elite and the people who are controlling reality know that as long as they repeat enough images and enough sentences over and over and over again, that people will just find it collapse, under the weight of the pressure. And so I think it's extremely important to be thinking all of the time about what you're buying into. And so certainly this book is a great book for Catholics and ex-Catholics. I was Catholic and left the church. We were in a parish in New Mexico, and a new priest came in who was definitely dangerous, and we had to leave and had to take our children out, which was actually quite sad for us because we benefited a lot from Catholic spirituality. But at the same time, once I'm outside of it and looking back into it, I think that I've written a book that will really help Catholics and ex-Catholics especially process some of the things that have been going on for them regarding being Catholic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting too because there is so much happening in the world. I was not raised Catholic. I was raised in another church that had very similar, well, not similar, but it was just very much brainwashing as far as I was concerned, and dangerous at the same time. Mm-hmm. of control of the mind and people, and I have family that's still in it. And I just look at the things that they do and say, and I'm like, wow, and not allowing people just to be who they are and letting their spirit be free. That's not very it's not healthy for us. So.
And which church was that, Jeremy? I couldn't hear you because your voice is a little bit soft. Or did you not say?
Oh, I can say. I mean, it was there. You probably remember a televangelist from the '60s, even the '40s. Named Herbert W. His name was Herbert W. Armstrong.
Oh yeah, and that's very powerful mind control. Again, the repetition issue. Wow.
Yeah, and that's what
and
I was raised.
Also the energy of a large group in a large crowd can just create instant mind control, which of course church officials and politicians and all that are experts at manipulating people that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why the work that you do is so important. This book is quite fascinating. I really I agree with you. This is going to help many people, and what's so good about it is that because it's in a story form, it's going to, I think when people read story or fiction, what they believe to be a novel, it starts opening their mind, but it doesn't come in a way to where it seems like fact.
Yeah, they don't have to argue with it,
Right.
Yeah, and then what was fun about writing it is each character has a different personality. Like Sarah is very scholarly and theological, and then there's another wonderful female character, Claudia Tagliati, who's an Italian intellectual. And there are parents in this book too, like the parents in Italy of the Pierleoni family are very educated and very fascinating. So what I did was I created really smart, intelligent people, just the kind of person that you would like to talk to for hours. But the difference between you talking to one intelligent person for a couple of hours, there's like 10 of them in the book. And they're all communicating with each other, and sometimes they even get together to have discussions. And that I was amazed at how it enabled me to take complex ideas and subtle thought and just take it to another level, just in the repartee between one character and another character.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it illustrates in the idea where the part where Sarah discovers that she's because it's a pretty complex concept for most people. She discovers that in a previous life she was an oracle, and that at first she doesn't get it because she's sitting at this one house and she just hears a woman's voice, and she's like, I don't know where that came from. That's pretty complex for the most people to understand that an inner voice from you can come deep within you, and it's from some previous life, maybe even 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And as she starts discovering herself and hearing that, she starts understanding the wholeness that she is. And, most people don't get that. And it's because they're looking to their priest or their pastor or whatever.
That might have been somewhat of a discovery of myself in a way. I just thought of it as you described it that way, because I just know what happened. Okay, once these characters all showed up, then the next question is, what did I do? I didn't plot anything. I just simply sat down and I let them go. And she was the first one who started out, of course, Sarah. And what happened is that she discovered this voice within herself, this oracular voice. And I actually think that all of us have an oracular voice within. And I think that we are meant to be oracles and we are meant to speak. And so I think that maybe Sarah, in a sense, kind of unleashed me a little bit to discover that part of myself. And then, of course, in the novel, it comes out in many different ways, but I think it's interesting how she gradually discovers what's going on with herself. And she would be the character probably who's the most like me, but I think all of the characters are fragments of me.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because it was about 2012 where I'd started hearing, I'd always heard a voice because of intuitive work and all that kind of stuff, but where I started feeling like there was hundreds and thousands of voices going on inside of me, and I thought, if I told anybody else this, I'd probably be Baker acted. And I laughed a little bit of the irony on that. And then I realized that there was these inner voices that were these aspects of me, I guess. And it was about that time. And of course, it took, I'd been formulating in my head probably for 5-6 years before that, but I hadn't really grasped it. And so it's interesting that as you write this book, and probably the next 2 books, these characters are going to be fleshed out, but like you said, they're a part of you. And
and of course then what we're doing when we do that also, we're tuning into the flow of the collective unconsciousness within ourselves. In Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, I described 9 dimensions of consciousness, and the third dimension being linear space and time, which is where we are right now. But then we are enfolded within the 4th dimension, the collective consciousness. And I think it flows through us, and I think we detect aspects of it when we tune in and go inside. And this is an important thing to understand, because that collective unconscious is what connects us with everybody else. So as we start to tune into that flow, this is actually the key to oneness. And many of us, of course, have been seeking oneness. We've been seeking that place in ourselves where we flow with all other beings, and that includes plants and animals and everything that lives. And I think we're seeking that, and I think the major way to get into that is to tune into the inner flow.
I think the Egyptians called it the river of gold. That's what connects all of us, from what I'm understanding. The soulful energy, I guess. I just thought about something, and I just wanted to ask your perspective on it. It's like when we're thinking about the dimensions and consciousness, and we're interconnected, and in this particular experience or this linear time and space, I call myself Jeremy, you call yourself Barbara, but our souls, and maybe there's an experience that comes up in your mind that you were an oracle 3,000 years ago. That same experience could have happened to somebody named Sally that lives in Texas. So it leads me to the question that are you aspects of the same soul, or is it because we're a massive consciousness and we're pulling experiences that we need when we need them? And as we're going throughout our human experience, and I think sometimes we try to put a linear perspective on our experience, our soulful experiences. So what is your perspective on that? Because it's
well, if we were to go, let's say we go back to 500 BC, 2,500 years ago, and then that was a period when oracles were speaking from oracular sites all over the planet. You and I, Jeremy, would have been two people who we probably wouldn't have been oracles, but we would have been very aware of what the oracle was teaching. You see what I mean? And so where that collective unconscious flows together is that one person may be speaking the voice at a given moment in time, but in fact, millions and millions of people are listening to that voice, and they're flowing with that energy. And that's really the only thing I think that explains the kind of mass migrations that are going on the planet at this time. There's a collective voice building up here of people demanding to be safe and demanding to be free and demanding to have a life, or otherwise they don't want to go on anymore. And they're going to walk and walk and walk until they can have a life. And this is really going to be challenging, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I'd said to a boss, probably like 5-6 years ago, I said, it would change all of the world, at least the corporate structure, because she was complaining about her job. And I said, all of corporate America just walked out of their job right now and said, I'm not going to do it anymore until I'm treated with respect and I'm allowed to have my soul be free.
Yeah.
And her face froze up. She goes, but I have bills I have to pay. And I was like, and that's why we're stuck. And so I said, I'm not in judgment. I'm just saying, I'm not like this is going to happen like tomorrow. I said, well, when we declare our empowerment in who we are, then we'll always be taken care of, but we don't believe that. So, so it's
and then as far as the migrations are concerned, in the trilogy, the second and third book in this book, I'm going after these early religions, because if you go into the Middle East, there's lots of different Christian religions, and there's lots of different religions that are even much older than Christianity. And what's happening right now is a destruction is going on in the fabric of these cultures. And it's very, very difficult, very painful for people to go through that. And yet, when we go through the change of an age, that's exactly what does happen. The old forms disappear, and the new creative forms are coming in.
Is it because of the ages? Because you say something interesting there. That's the further I go back, most people would say that, that have started exploring this, they would say it's Christianity or modern-day Christianity that caused, or the Catholic Church that caused oppression. And more and more I go back, it's like you're talking about, even back to ancient Hebrew times, when we talk about Yahweh and stuff like that, I find that even further back this has been happening. And so, like, how far back does oppression go? And then is it some kind of elite group that's been doing it, or a bloodline that's been doing it, or is it because of the energy of the ages that's caused this? And now, of course, Aquarius is very open and free and enlightened. So it leads me to believe that there's an energy that's changing, like we've been talking, consciousness.
Yeah, and you're going right after the thematic material of a book I wrote in 2001 called Catastrophobia, and then that was republished in 2011 as Awakening the Planetary Mind. The reason it was republished is that so much change had gone on from 2001 to 2011 that I had to rewrite the book. And the basic thesis of Catastrophobia and Awakening the Planetary Mind is that our planet went through a series of cataclysms around 11,000, 12,000 years ago. And as a result of those cataclysms, and during that time, human society was almost completely destroyed. And the thesis in Catastrophobia and Awakening the Planetary Mind is that we have been basically a multi-traumatized species for about 11 or 12,000 years. And so I believe that we not only are moving into the age of Aquarius and into the age of more awareness, but I also think that we're overcoming our multi-traumatized species issues. And so that's why everything that's going on is so intense and so compelling, because people are just breaking through blocks that have held them back, not just during this lifetime, but during hundreds and thousands of years.
That makes complete sense. I brought up to a friend. I have a few friends that are psychiatrists and psychologists, and they're breaking away from that paradigm. And I asked them the question. I said, I feel like the world suffers from a global post-traumatic stress disorder, and because they react to the smallest little thing. And I think Paul Levy's work calls it Wetiko, and like a psychic psychosis or something. And it makes complete sense that all the things that happened 11,000 years, that long ago, people are just,
Well, see, then what the book goes through, what the book goes through is the book goes through the whole timeline. It's basically a book that covers 20,000 years of human consciousness, because I had to go back into what were we like before we got knocked off the edge of the earth, so to speak. And so the book goes through. If you go back to like 10,000 BC, then after the cataclysms are finished, then the oceans rise, and there's a tremendous amount of deprivation on the planet. There's a huge struggle going on from like 9,000 BC to maybe 5,000 BC just to survive. And then we come up to like 5,000 BC, 4,000 BC, and we start to see civilization, and we start to see culture emerging again. And so it isn't just about the cataclysms, it's about the recovery. In many ways, if you were faced with dealing with a huge cataclysm, you might rather be the person who died rather than the person who survived, if you know what I mean. And so this issue is dealing with just basic survivalism. And that is what I think has been, at least in my lifetime, what I have seen gripping people is a deep issue over survivalism. And I think if we can just start to release that and start to be there for each other and live and help each other instead of always trying to personally survive, I think that's going to be one of the transformations.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and it's interesting. The book actually reminds me, because I just thought about this. This leads all the way up into the Pope resigning, which I totally forgot happened a few years ago. And that's a precedent, because how many popes have actually resigned in history, and why did he resign?
Yeah, and two have resigned, and he's one of them. And the other pope was a minor pope who was around for a few months back in the 800s. So really, Benedict the 16th, who used to be Cardinal Ratzinger, is really the only one who has resigned like this. And he not only resigned, but he's still in the Vatican. And so one of the things that happened for me was I started writing this book in 2011, and I kept on going. You have to when you're creating, you just have to trust. I just had to believe that what I was doing mattered. And then in February 2013, the Pope resigned, and I went, wow, I've got a book. Because then what happens in this novel is the Pope resigns and the new Pope comes in. And of course, Francis is going to be a major character through this trilogy. He just arrives in the first book, and then he's going to develop. And I just think it's amazing that my book is coming forth right at the point when Francis is in the United States, in Washington, New York. It's really amazing, right now. He's in Philadelphia, on the radio, and he's in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, by the way, had one of the nastiest sex scandals of all of the parishes in the United States. The worst ones were in Los Angeles, Boston, and Philadelphia. And the whole parish and diocese in Philadelphia has just been reamed by the sexual scandals and the lawsuits and the loss of money and the collapse of their parishes. And there's the Pope, who obviously is giving people hope. Yeah, and
and then his whole energy, or at least people think that the cover story, I guess, that they're giving him is he's the Pope of the people, and he's bringing a lot of great change. And you can see in his eyes when you look, he's not bringing great change. His energy is, you can see the deception in his eyes if you really look.
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah, glad you said that. Like Pope Hope, eh?
Right.
Our language is so, sound-coded.
And this has started... this book is about the change the bringing, changing of the religions and going into the spirituality. And it's like I had an experience a couple weeks ago. This is slightly off topic, as I live like 4 miles from the Scientology headquarters and in Clearwater. And I drove by it, and there was all these children walking around downtown Clearwater. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a very small area, wearing these shirts saying purification on them. And I thought to myself, what the heck is purification? And, of course, I Google searched it, and I did not like the answer. It was not something that I really thought of was great. And so, a lot of these sex scandals are around children in the Catholic Church. And the very essence of, the youth that, brings in new ideas, and the innocence of our children is being taken by these churches. And and of course you mentioned he's in Philadelphia right now, so it is very ironic that we're talking about this book that talks about the church and everything it's done, in this particular weekend when we're speaking.
Yeah, and of course the central theme I'm after is how does evil get into the world? Like, the question would be, how did evil get into the world in the first place? And I think we could take a look at those cataclysms and what that created in people's minds. And then there's the issue of how does evil keep on being in the world, and what are the avenues for evil? And that's where it was such fun with fiction again, to create an evil character, Armando Pierleoni, an aristocratic Italian, and then to explore his experience with evil in his life, including with his Jungian analyst. The character that showed up later, once the novel got going, is a Jungian analyst. And so we have this deep insight into a person who basically, Armando is struggling with being possessed and dealing with demons. He's kind of an archetype of the fallen angel. And that's something that we really do need to understand. And you'd have to say, well, why do we need to understand it? Well, one of the things I'm exploring is that nobody has to be controlled or taken out by evil. I think that each one of us has the ability to create discernment and consciousness, so that we one of the ways, of course, you bring evil into the world is you do something evil yourself. And so if you can just get yourself to the point where you're into complete integrity in your relationships and in everything that's going on in your life, right there, the doorway to evil is just shut. So I'm exploring it. The point would be, why talk about it? I'm going back into the Gnostics, and I'm talking about what they had to say about evil in the world. But what would be the point unless we as individuals have some way to handle this issue?
That makes a lot of sense, and you see it. I see it in my practice where I work with somebody, and we all have this in us. And when I've made not such good decisions, and I start going down a path, and I realize there's been a few paths I've gone down when I was young, and I think back, if I would have kept going down that path, the darkness I would have went into, and then when would I have crossed that line?
Yeah. It's just that moment, and it can be such a small thing, really, but that moment where you just opt for doing something really negative when you so could have easily chosen something that would have been positive for you and for others. And it's just something we learn. It's character development. But novels, especially in the 19th century, novelists wrote novels in order to instruct their readers about morality. And by the way, this novel is not at all preachy or anything like that. It just simply shows, by the choices that characters make, it just shows what happens as a result of what they decide to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that it started the. It's not preachy. I mean, it's actually it's really a novel. I want the listeners listening. This is really a novel, and you're just going to enjoy it, and it's and of course take a lot out of it at the same time. And before we continue on, I just want to let everybody know that Barbara's website is www.handclow2012.com. So you can definitely check out all of her books there, and a lot about her as well.
And they're on Amazon. They're in bookstores, all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. so, but
well,
I mean,
so
there's
what is a novel? You know, because this is my issue since I wrote nonfiction, although I love fiction, and I think a novel is a book where when you open the first page, you enter into a world, usually in another location. In this case, Rome and Tuscany for the most part. And you go into another world, and you stay in that world until you close that page. And you read without judgment. You read just with pleasure. And then after you finish a novel, often you find that it makes you think about quite a few things in your life. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Well, I've read several, fiction books where I gain so much about it because it inspires you and it opens up a part of yourself that, I read a lot of nonfiction too, but it opens up your mind to other possibilities, and it's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. So, it's really interesting. So, what the first book is really about her. From my understanding, it's about her personal journey of opening up. Where do we go into the second and third books, or if you wrote them already?
I'm working on the sequel right now, and what happens is it just keeps on going. So it's got a group of people, parents and children, and now one character even has a child, and so we have a young character coming in, and it just simply is a view of the world through these extremely intelligent people. And then you'd have to ask, well, why are we in Rome and why are we in Tuscany? Well, when I was writing about the Mayan calendar, and I was a Mayan calendar researcher for about 30, 40 years, so I'm one of those people who was waiting for the end of the Mayan calendar for a long time to see what would happen. And when I went into calendar research, I ran into the research of Dr. Carl Johan Kalaman, the Swedish biologist. Did you run into any of that stuff? He's the guy who believes the calendar ended in 2011. And he's the guy who has a whole analysis of the calendar that covers 16.4 billion years. It's a long-term view of human evolution. And so one of the things that I'm exploring in this book is through these characters, because these characters are savvy about these issues. Because I think, do you remember harmonic convergence, Jeremy?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. You remember how when it happened, nobody thought it was anything? And then year by year by year, more and more people look back and said, wow, something really changed then, Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same thing with the Mayan calendar. I think already people are realizing that something really fundamental has happened. And so the reason for the whole trilogy is I don't think I can get a grasp on that change without covering it over a period of about 10 years. You can imagine that, because it's a very difficult thing to bring out, to elucidate.
I think that's, because the 10-year period, if you were to just say a year-long period, I might see things, but I'll just give an example of my own life, like 2006 to 2010, I had a substantial amount of things happen to me that are very awakening, but during the time frame, it didn't feel like awakening.
Yeah, exactly,
very painful, and it was through that taught me, a lot about how pain can actually it opens us up. We don't have to experience pain, but we go through it as a process. And so now looking back 10 years, in perspective, 10 years later, through that time frame, I've grown as a person. I was, of course, in my early 30s at the time. So,
yeah, and that's where I had fun, because it sounds to me like you're probably, were you born in the 60s?
I was born in the 70s, 74.
74, okay, and I was born in 43, so we're definitely a different generation, and that's why I've got two generations. I've got your generation, and I have the parental generation, because having the parental generation gives me the chance to have people reflecting on what they're observing, because when you're in the middle of it all, you're a father of a young child or whatever is going on with you, you're basically not observing anything. If you can get out the door in the morning, it's an accomplishment, And I've been there. I had 4 children. I know what that one's like. And so I wanted the parental generation as a reflective element in the novel, or I didn't think that I could get enough perspectives on this. I mean, let's say that the world is changing fundamentally right now. It's going to really be valuable if we have people who have written about this shifting, because it's going so fast now that you can't grasp it anymore. You can't get a perspective easily.
Absolutely. Well, you're absolutely right, because my generation goes to work. They have mortgages. They have children. Some of them even have grandchildren, that are, in their even in their early 40s. And so, but they're young grandchildren, so they're really just thinking about their family and bills and those kind of things. So they're not taking a lot of time for introspective.
Yeah. And and another thing, now that since I'm the parent and you're the child, okay. Now that I've gotten to this point, now I realize I had really remarkable parents, and now I realize that they had all kinds of deep thought and all kinds of deep awareness about what was going on around me, but I barely noticed anything that they had to say. So I guess I'm trying to give parents a voice in the sense with their wisdom and their knowledge. And I don't mean just my generation. This would apply to generations going back, way back in time.
I get that. I told my grandmother when I was 21, she said, if you kids would just listen to me, I would. Life would be a lot easier. And I said to her, well, I said, Grandma, I said, I'm not supposed to listen to you right now, but I don't know where this is coming from, but one day you'll make sense. Yeah. And sure enough, she did. So a question I have is, where did the ruby crystal come into play? As far as the name just resonates with me. Yeah. Revelations of the ruby crystal, and I know it's a Buddhist. It was the the third eye of a Buddha statue. But where did you come up with that inspiration?
Well, I'm wearing it right now. So
really?
Years and years ago, a spiritual teacher gave me a ruby crystal that then I set, not an expensive one, but just one of those cabochon ones, But it was the first thing we found out about it. We had it examined, and it was cut a very, very long time ago with very unusual tools. We know that about it. So the only thing I really know about it is 3 or 4 psychics have read this crystal over the years, and they've all said that it goes back to this being in the third eye of a Buddha in Nepal about 10,000 years ago. So I've been wearing it and working with it all of these years, and then for some reason I was inspired in the novel to have it come. It's given to Sarah as an engagement present, and then it makes her immediately psychic.
Wow.
And so that's where the whole thing came from. But you'd have to say you also could say it's a literary device, because there are other things. There's a crystal skull in the book. There's other crystals, but I work a lot with crystals. And so I find that when I work with them while I'm writing, a great deal more insight comes through me.
Wow. Very cool. So now, what that leads me to the next question. Did you have that similar experience with the ring you're wearing? Or is that just a part of the story? Did you have a similar experience with the ring, with the crystal?
I'm trying to think of
because you wear it.
Not really. I've of course known to be a psychic all these years, and maybe for all I know it comes from wearing the crystal. But it just started as soon as I started the novel, then it started to speak, and it started to give information. And it's continuing to do that.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. I know we mentioned that we talked about Sarah being, and all the characters being archetypes of you, and I just thought, wonder if Sarah is really her, just a fictional aspect of it, and it just led me to ask that question. So
that's what's fun about writing fiction, because what happens, you set them up in a scene, and then you let them start talking to each other, and I literally never know what's going to happen until it actually happens.
That makes sense.
I'm sitting here fascinated, like, wow, and things will happen early on in the book that actually mean something 300 pages later. And you get to the end of the book, and something goes on, and you realize, like, wow, that's all related to what happened in the beginning. And so that's how people paint. That's how people do music. That's how people write. You just have to let it. It's the old thing of like following the muse. You could say that the ruby crystal is my muse.
Gotcha. That makes sense. It's actually fairly cool. And it's almost like your life has come in, and then your life has come into the book, but then of course the characters develop themselves throughout the novel.
I would also say that my pain comes into the book because of my own painful experiences with the church. And I've been educated, BA and master's in the church, in theology, and it's been this period of time in the Catholic Church has been very, very painful. And so I want to expose that pain because it's so huge for people. I mean, we had to leave the church because of an abusing priest in our parish. And that's terrible when you think about it.
Yeah, especially the organization that's what you look to for healing is actually causing your pain.
Yeah, and then you just passed him on to somebody else once he got caught,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually heard a lot of stories, and some very friends that are very close to me where they were wives of husbands that were molested when they were kids, and imagine the pain that they pass on to their wife, and that of course gets passed on to their children, and then grandchildren and grandchildren's
Yeah, so see, that's what I'm trying, this issue of evil. That's why I'm really going deeply after evil, because I think if people can start to see evil for what it is and not deny it anymore, I think they can change themselves in relationship to it. I actually think that's true, and the only way I can show that, of course, is to have some of the characters have that kind of experience.
Well, and that happens with Armando because he tries to rape her in one of the chapters that I read, and of course she's really upset. But then he, from my understanding of the book, he goes through a redemption. You're even mentioned here that he has almost like a possession going on with him. And so who caused that? This evil that's within him, this possession, or did he consciously make a choice?
We can't give the plot away too much.
Okay.
What caused it is revealed, but we can't give the whole plot away.
Yeah, of course. So of course, it's just it's interesting when you think about the journey. So we're down to, believe it or not, about 8 minutes left of the show, which I always am shocked at how fast shows go by. Mm. What are some things that you would like to leave the listener, prior to us ending the show? Any thoughts that you would like to share?
My only thought would be that even though I'm describing these times as being very difficult right now, it's also just fascinating to be alive at this point in time. And so I think that the more that we can just live in the midst of this chaos and live in the midst of this change and accept it for change, because it just simply is change, and things are becoming something else. I think that the more we can just be with that energy, I think we're going to be fine, and I think it's very fascinating and exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And then you can really see what I get excited about is every day I see things happening in front of my very eyes, or people that I see, or friends, or loved ones, or the people I talk to on the show, and I really see an awakening happening, and I'm like, it's not what I expected when people talked about it, in 1999 or 1998 or 1995. It was not what I expected. And, of course, back then I was thinking of something more sensational. But what I have seen is something even greater. It's a peace that's coming that I see. Even though I see a lot of chaos, I see a peace within me, and I see a peace within other people that is happening. And I actually see people saying things that I've been trying to say to people, and I know you've been trying to say to people for years. Just get into yourself and love yourself. Find your passion. Enjoy yourself.
Yeah, and they wake up just like that. Things, as you said, things that we studied for years, people wake up in a day. And, of course, that's the purpose of a novel like this. This novel is extremely entertaining and very funny and very gripping. But what happens is I've already done a couple of book presentations, and quite a few of the people who have read the book all the way through said it was like having a Reiki session. They said that the book just awakened them so much that it took them days to settle down. And so this is definitely the purpose of this book, is to help more and more and more people wake up. That's another reason I switched to fiction, because I think fiction has the potential to attract a larger audience. Absolutely.
Well, I'm looking forward to finishing the book and hearing about and seeing your next books. I think it's, I definitely feel the energy, exactly what they're talking about, like having a Reiki session, because I feel as I'm even just being, starting to think about the book, I felt shifting, and then reading it, of course, has been pretty incredible. I just want to remind everybody that Barbara's website is www.handcloud2012.com. Barbara, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. It has been very enlightening, and I look forward to future shows with you.
Jeremy, thank you for having me, because as you know, this is the only way to get the word out. And it's been a joy talking with you.
Thank you so much, and you have a wonderful Saturday.
I will.
Many blessings to everybody else. Bye-bye.